Welcome to Strange Truths and Tall Tales, the product of Newfoundland podcast. This is the place for anyone who's fascinated by Newfoundland's rich tapestry of stories, history, and culture. I'm Robert, your host and guide through the curious, the legendary, and the downright strange. You might know me from my writing at Product of Newfoundland, where I dive deep into the stories of this island. Here, at the podcast, we bring those stories to life. From folklore to forgotten truths to the quirky traditions that make us who we are. Whether you're a born and bred Newfoundlander or a curious outsider, there's something here for you. So grab a cup of tea, settle in, and let's explore the stories that make Newfoundland what it is, one tale at a time. You're traveling through the fog, and just ahead is an island of mermaids, miracles, and monsters. Your next stop? Newfoundland, and these are its strange truths and tall tales. Alright, let's get started. In this episode, I'm interested in getting on the right side of history, quite literally. I'm talking about the 1940s and the time Newfoundland switched from driving on the left to driving on the right. Now, by itself, this might seem like a small change, but it happened during a much bigger moment in our history. When Newfoundland was trying to figure out its identity, would we remain an independent nation or join Canada as a province? Helping me explore this pivotal time is none other than Newfoundland legend Greg Malone. We'll dive into the quirky details, the politics, and the cultural shifts of the era. Then, as always, we'll cap off the episode with Monstrous Things, this time featuring a tale of a sea monster off Cape Friels that'll make you think twice about dipping a toe in the water. Let's get to it. Today we're spending a few minutes where history meets the open road, a day that changed the course of Newfoundland's streets and maybe hinted at bigger, scarier changes coming. I'm talking about January 2nd, 1942. It was a day of firsts, a day of nerves, and maybe even a day of bewildered horses. This is the story of how Newfoundland switched from driving on the left-hand side of the road to the right. Picture it. It's early morning, January 2nd, 1947. A new traffic law has gone into effect, requiring all drivers to switch to the right-hand side of the road. For Newfoundlanders, this was no small feat. Generations had grown up driving on the left, as they still do in Britain and Australia. But the times were changing. Much of North America already drove on the right. Quebec and Ontario always had, and the maritime provinces had made the switch in the 1920s. For Newfoundland, with its strong ties to Britain, the transition came later. Not everyone was convinced it was a good idea. Drivers were anxious, fearing their habits would lead to confusion, or worse, accidents. Vehicles on the island were a mix of left-hand and right-hand drive, which added to the chaos. Some drivers were used to gauging their position by keeping an eye on the ditch, and there was real concern that switching sides would send them either off the road or into oncoming traffic. To calm nerves, one suggestion was to paint a clear dividing line on the roads, at least in the snow-free months. So why the switch? Many point to the influence of North American military bases in Newfoundland during World War II. Bases in Stephenville, Argentia, and St. John's operated under U.S. laws, which meant driving on the right. They also brought a wave of right-hand drive vehicles to the island, adding to the growing familiarity with right-side driving. Canadian soldiers stationed in Newfoundland sometimes drove on the right too, though one learned the hard way this wasn't always acceptable. In 1945, a Canadian soldier caused a head-on collision near Tor Bay while driving on the right. He was fined $2 for his mistake. The government announced the switch in February 1946, but the timing was controversial. While it gave people nearly 11 months to prepare, not everyone was thrilled with the timeline. Some argued that winter, with its icy roads and low visibility, wasn't the best time for such a monumental change. One concerned citizen, Walter J. Ruth, even wrote to the Western Star suggesting April might be safer. And then there was the worry about New Year's Day itself. As the Evening Telegram suggested, wouldn't drivers still be recovering from the night before? To address some of these concerns, at least the ones related to sleepiness and potential inebriation, the government moved the start date from January 1st to January 2nd, giving drivers a day to recover. As the day approached, the government launched a major awareness campaign. Newspapers were filled with safety ads. The message was everywhere. Drive slowly, drive safely, drive right. But it wasn't just motorists who had to adapt. Pedestrians were told to walk on the left facing oncoming traffic, and public transit systems had to adjust too. In St. John's, Golden Arrow coaches warned passengers that buses would now be unloading into the street, into traffic, rather than at the curb. Even horses, who were still active on the streets in 1947, had to adapt. Many had a lifetime of training telling them to move on the left. So how did the big day go? Well, it went surprisingly well. Extra police were stationed at busy intersections in St. John's, like Rollins Cross, but the transition was smooth. Cars moved cautiously at first, and even the horses managed to adjust, despite a few looking, as one newspaper put it, bewildered. By the end of the day, life on the right side of the road had begun. The Evening Telegram described the change as unobtrusive and praised Newfoundlanders for adapting so quickly. I can't help but think that some of the initial resistance to the change was about more than just traffic. I think it had to be about identity too. In the late 1940s, Newfoundland was at a crossroads. In just 2 years, the island would join Canada as its newest province. For some, the move to right-hand driving symbolized a step away from Britain and signaled a closer tie to North America. As one article put it, in the change to keep right, there may be something symbolic of the new constitutional order Newfoundland is contemplating. And that's the story of Newfoundland's big switch, a moment that was probably practical and just a little symbolic. For the full story, complete with images of the government's right side drive ads, check out the post The Day Newfoundland Started Driving on the Right at my blog, productofnewfoundland.ca. Before we jump into the meat of today's episode, let's set the stage and take a quick dive into Newfoundland in the first half of the 20th century. It was a time of rapid change. The First World War initially brought prosperity to Newfoundland, with new wealth flowing into the colony. It was a time of optimism and progress. Roads were built, railways expanded, and a regiment was sent to join the British on the front lines. However, despite early successes, by the 1920s, Newfoundland found itself in a deepening financial crisis. By the end of the 1920s, Newfoundland was in debt. The Great Depression only worsened the situation. The economy collapsed, and the colony faced bankruptcy. In 1934, desperate to avoid financial ruin, Newfoundland's leaders suspended responsible government. It was governed by an unelected commission government directed by Britain. But the tide would turn once again. During the Second World War, Newfoundland offered an important strategic advantage. American, British, and Canadian forces invested heavily in the region, turning the colony into a key location for military operations. This influx of military spending brought prosperity back to Newfoundland. By 1949, Newfoundland had not only cleared its debts, but was also enjoying a $40 million surplus. But the question of Newfoundland's future remained unanswered. It was still being governed by a commission. In 1946, an elected national convention was established to debate the colony's political future. Should Newfoundland continue under commission of government, return to responsible government, or join Canada? What followed was a 2-year-long debate that would decide Newfoundland's fate. The pro-Canadian Confederation camp argued that joining Canada would improve living standards and provide economic stability. Their campaign was supported by Britain, who encouraged Newfoundland to join its North American neighbor. But not everyone agreed. Opponents of Confederation were divided into 2 groups. The Responsible Government League sought to restore Newfoundland's status as it was before 1933, under self-rule. Meanwhile, the Economic Union Party wanted responsible government, but also emphasized closer economic ties with the United States. The referendum of June 3, 1948, brought the debate to a head. Responsible government received 44.6% of the vote, Confederation 41.1%, and the Commission of Government option just 14.3%. However, the results weren't final. A runoff vote was held in July between Responsible Government and Confederation. In the end, Confederation emerged victorious with 52.34% of the vote, just edging out self-government, which garnered 47.66%. Joey Smallwood, now the face of Confederation, led a team to Ottawa to negotiate the terms of entry with Canada. The British and Canadian parliaments approved the terms of union, which would officially incorporate Newfoundland into Canada. The terms also restored Newfoundland's legislature and responsible government, which had been suspended since 1933. On March 31st, 1949, Newfoundland officially became Canada's 10th province, marking the end of an era of British control and the beginning of a new chapter in Canadian history. Newfoundland's journey into Confederation was anything but simple. It was a path marked by war, economic struggle, political turmoil, and a fierce battle over the future. But in the end, Newfoundland found its place within the Canadian Federation, forever changing the course of history. With all that in mind, we're going to move on to today's special guest, who can tell you a lot more about Newfoundland's sometimes suspect slide into Confederation. Today's episode features someone who truly needs no introduction, though I'm going to give him one anyway, because his incredible career deserves it. Our special guest is none other than Greg Malone. His body of work speaks for itself. From the wonderful grand band to CODCO, his wicked satire graced our living rooms every week. His unforgettable impersonation of Barbara Frum, well, it remains iconic to this day. But Greg's talents don't stop at comedy. He's ventured into politics and fought passionately for causes he believes in, and continues to shine as an actor in TV and film. He's also a gifted writer with 2 books to his name, a memoir titled You Better Watch Out, and a fascinating piece of historical nonfiction, Don't Tell the Newfoundlanders, The True Story of Confederation. The latter book, by the way, is about to become a TV docuseries, a project we'll be discussing in detail today. It's not every day you get to sit down with someone who's had such a multifaceted career and left such an indelible stamp on culture. I'm absolutely delighted, and more than a little bit excited, to welcome Greg Malone to the show. Greg, thanks so much for joining me.
How you doing, Robert? Nice to be here.
I am absolutely delighted that you are here. It may be a little bit of an understatement to say that I am a fan. I'm a big fan. I'm sure you hear that a lot,
Well,
but
good. No, I like hearing it.
you probably don't remember this, but I remember this. We've actually met before in a surprisingly similar format. Years ago, on this blog that I keep, Product of Newfoundland, I started a petition to have CODCO released on DVD. And that petition got a little bit of traction and was picked up by CBC nationally. And you and I both appeared on an afternoon show on CBC to talk about why everybody should be watching CODCO.
Oh, really? Really? We were much younger then.
Yeah, it was, I don't know, probably like 2006, 2007, that kind of era, maybe.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, I started when this book came out, Don't Tell the Newfoundlanders. I I thought maybe there was some distance between maybe your writing for Wonderful Grand Band and CODCO and this book.
Mm,
But then I thought maybe there's not that much of a distance after all. I mean, your comedy has always sort of tended towards challenging societal norms and prompting us to question things.
mm.
And Don't Tell the Newfoundlanders definitely does that. How did you come to this book? Why was this a book you wanted to take on?
Well, the whole story of Confederation has always been shrouded in a mystery, and a negative mystery. There's always the hint that it wasn't done right, that it was badly done, and it was the Newfoundlanders were railroaded in, really. And really, when I started out as an actor, I went to Toronto to seek my fame and fortune at a certain point when I was 23. And like I like to say, I went to Toronto a Canadian, and I came back a Newfoundlander, because when I got to Toronto, and not everyone was the same. The arts community was great, but the general community was like, people thought, they laughed at you when you said you were from Newfoundland right away, because that was somehow a joke. And like they said, well, do you live in igloos? Have you ever seen television? This is in 1970. So I thought, what's going on here? And the idea of stupid Newfie was like a Newfie joke. Everything was a joke from Newfoundland, and all the Polish jokes were also the Newfoundland jokes, same jokes, different nationality. And the root cause of that, I realized, was that it was stupid Newfies who gave away their own country. Stupid Poles lost their country to Russia, right? You know what I mean? That was at the heart of it.
Okay.
Plus the fact of how it was done was so abusive. The British really put a negative spin on Newfoundland's character in order to take over the place in 1934. Newfoundland was a dominion, the Dominion of Newfoundland, like the Dominion of Canada. But it was only a small country, much smaller population. And so the Depression kind of, for smaller countries, they didn't have the credit base to survive the Great Depression. So they needed help from somewhere. Nowadays, the IMF, it will give you financial aid, but you have to be a democracy. In those days, that wasn't there. And Britain said, we'll give you financial aid, but we'll take over the government. You've mismanaged it. We'll take over. It sent a shockwave through the empire. It's completely against all imperial thinking in the 20th century to go back to being a colony. Everyone was getting out. But, so they said that the Newfoundlanders were not up to democracy. They were corrupt. They were a lot of graft and political corruption, and they were unfit for democracy. And so we're going to give them a rest from politics. This was 1933. And very much like, Germany and Italy were enjoying a rest from politics under Hitler, Mussolini. It was the style of the times. Democracy was not in enjoying good favor, because the Depression was being blamed on democracy as opposed to capitalist greed, which was really the root cause of it, unregulated greed. But so that negative spin on Newfoundland, Canadians had a very condescending attitude towards Canada because it was a small dominion, it was poor relative to Canada, and Canada was always waiting for it to give up and become Canadian, but Newfoundlanders didn't want that. They were always in competition with Canada. They didn't trust Canada. So that's the background of it. So when I got to Canada, I was born in 1948, a year before we became Canadians. I was born a Newfoundlander. But when I got there, I was confronted with this kind of prejudice that was, and it was right across the country, and it came from the top down, really. It wasn't that long ago that Stephen Harper said, we can't afford to support a bunch of Newfies lying around on a rock. And he was running for prime minister. And, so that was, and that's such ignorance. I wrote the book because actually we started CODCO because of that, to confront that attitude and that prejudice against Newfoundlanders. We made a show where we laughed at ourselves and laughed at the Canadians and the whole situation. It was called Caught on a Stick. It was a big success in Toronto. Canadians loved it. After we laughed at ourselves a bunch, they felt that they needed to be laughed at too. And so they wanted to get in on it. They came to the shows. They loved it. And that's how CODCO started. And CODCO was always very political, very satirical. We always did political stuff. Especially me, I was kind of always drawn to that satire, right? With Barbara Frum and the news angle. And I did Reagan, I did Trudeau, I did them all, right? Whoever was there, I did them, the Queen. So that was always a very strong trend in CODCO, this undercurrent of subversive political messages. And so we dealt with a lot of stereotypes and laughed at a lot of that kind of stuff. And, we dealt with AIDS when AIDS came along, and no one was dealing with this stuff when we were dealing with it.
I've been rewatching some of the CODCO stuff lately, and I can't believe in some ways that You guys got away with saying and doing some of the things that you did in that time period.
I know, I know. I felt like we were in this window. We had this window, and we did the shows out of Halifax, not Toronto. That gave us a certain distance from the center
Mhm.
and a certain freedom, you know. But anyway, they accepted a lot of it. They were looking for it was a kind of the guy who was in charge of CBC at the time, Evan Fissan, was kind of ahead of his game for CBC, and he was trying to bring it up, make it like the NBC of America. You know what I mean? With a lot of comedy and satire and that kind of stuff. So that's what he was at. So we did CODCO and that, and so I always had that political. When CODCO was over, I did other projects, but I also did the project of they were trying to privatize Newfoundland Labrador Hydro, and a lot of people were against it. And they asked me to be the spokesman, and I went in and I imitated the premier. I did him and made everyone laugh at his whole plan. And so eventually it was stopped. And I had a partner doing it. His name was Jim Halley. He was an older guy, a lawyer, who had been a lawyer during the battle for Confederation and for independence. Uh, and he was a great strategist in that campaign to get Hydro back. And I stayed friends with him. And he had all this material on Newfoundland's Confederation, all these books and newspapers and all the stuff he'd saved over the years, because him and John Crosby's father, Ches Crosby, had started the Economic Union with America Party, as opposed to the Confederate Party and the independent government. Because when the British had to get out of here at the end of the war, they were stone cold broke. They kind of wanted to hang on because the reason they took the place over in the first place in 33 was to get the North Atlantic air route. Everything everything that flew from North America to Europe had to stop in Newfoundland to gas up. You know what I mean? They had to refuel in Newfoundland. Nothing was nonstop. Everything, Newfoundland's like 1,000 miles further out in the Atlantic than New York. So that was a considerable advantage. So the Lindbergh was here, Amelia Earhart was here, Alcock and Brown took off from here. Right through the Second World War, all the planes going back and forth. They landed at Gander and Goose Bay. That was the nexus of world travel, really, for decades. And when the British came here for dealing with the financial crisis, there was a big air conference here in Newfoundland with the States and Britain and Ireland and Newfoundland and Canada and everything. And they were working out air traffic and modern aviation, civil aviation and military aviation. It was in Newfoundland. And the British delegation were horrified to discover Lindbergh here making deals with the Newfoundland government for airspace and concessions and landing rights and everything, looking for airdrome in Newfoundland. They considered Newfoundland theirs psychologically. It was the Dominion of Newfoundland, a British Dominion, and they wanted control over that North Atlantic air route. So they thought, we'll take over the place. We'll use the financial crisis as our pretext, and it serves both purposes. So they took over, and right away they built Gander, the largest airport in the world, in 1934, in the middle of the Great Depression. $5 million. And, you know,
I
that was the reason they got it. Yeah.
I live in Gander now. We're still steeped in our airport history here. It's something we've
Oh,
never forgotten.
Gander's got a great history. Everyone has stopped in Gander, as you know, right? From Castro to the Queen, they all stopped in
Yeah.
Gander, right?
Yep. Yeah.
So they took the place over, and but the big story in the book is the Confederation story, and that Britain was broke. They had a huge war debt with Canada, $2.6 billion war debt. They were on rations still. They wanted to hang on to Newfoundland and make it that British bastion that they'd always talked about, keep a foothold in North America. But Maynard Keynes, the economics guru, Keynesian economics, said to them, "No, we are broke. You can't afford, to feed yourself. You can't afford to hold on to Newfoundland." And the Americans, Roosevelt, he didn't want Newfoundland to get its independence back. So Britain couldn't just hand its independence back. They had to accommodate Roosevelt. And if they gave Newfoundland to Canada, They might get their war debt forgiven. That's what they really wanted, to get rid of that $2.6 billion. At a secret meeting between all of them, the British and the Canadians, they agree that Canada will get Newfoundland and Britain will forgive the war debt and give another $1 billion loan at very low interest to Britain. Britain got everything it wanted. All it had to do was deliver in
Okay,
an election.
where was Newfoundland during all of this?
Newfoundland was under British rule. These were top secret meetings that no one knew about. Britain and Canada were lying to their own parliaments, lying to their own people, saying we have no interest in Newfoundland. It's up to them to make their own decision. We're not trying to influence it in any way. And secretly, they were working like madcaps because, like, the Americans really didn't want it to go independent because, by the end of the war, this is one thing I found out afterwards. The Americans were here during the war, 20,000 strong, 5 of the largest bases outside the US, hundreds of millions of dollars spent here. Big, big investment. And from 1949, 48, 49 onwards, after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they began to stockpile nuclear weapons in Newfoundland because of its strategic location. So there were nuclear weapons in St. John's, all the way up to Nain, Labrador. One of the first stockpiles in the world of nuclear weapons was here, which no one knew. They didn't tell us they were bringing them in. They just brought them.
I mean, logically, looking at the scenario you've laid out there, it's not. It doesn't make sense to think that Britain wouldn't have had any interest in Newfoundland at the time. Transatlantic air travel was basically in its infancy, really, and Newfoundland was ideally situated, as you say. For them to say that they didn't care what our future was or our fate was couldn't be true. They would like to have had, some kind of agreement, either with us or Canada, where it was in their favor.
Yeah, they would, and Canada, for its part, was desperate to get Newfoundland, even though they feigned indifference. Really, there was a whole core in the Canadian government: C.D. Howe, Saint Laurent, Jack Pickersgill, the Prime Minister Mackenzie King's private secretary, his executive secretary. All these guys really wanted to get it, and get it like through Britain. Not half of the government in Canada wanted Newfoundland to get its government back, its parliament back, and then negotiate Confederation directly with Newfoundland. But the other half of the cabinet wanted, no, we'll never get it that way. We're going to get it from Britain. We'll just take it from Britain and let them make it happen for us. And so that's what they did in the end, because Canada, two things happened. They had the states over there up in Alaska. If Canada didn't take over Newfoundland, America was already there. Thousands of troops, nuclear weapons, bases, and money, and they were very popular in Newfoundland. So they could very easily have exerted their influence in taken over the island, which they would have done if it had gone independent. They would have exerted their influence, and Canada knew that. So rather than risk that, Canada would be choked off completely. You would have had America right at the mouth of the St. Lawrence. You would have had to, cap tip your way out of your own country to get out in the Atlantic. They couldn't have that.
You have a great quote in the book about what you say is, if the American relationship with Newfoundland was a marriage of the heart, as was often said, it certainly seemed that any marriage between Canada and Newfoundland would require a shotgun.
Yes, it is. Yes, yeah.
Americans were well liked here during the war times, for sure. And
they
I think
didn't have the prejudices that the Canadians brought with them. They were very egalitarian, and they paid a good wage for the job that they hired. Newfoundlanders built all those bases, and they were paid $1,500 a year. A fisherman at the time earned $300 a year. So that was well received, right?
For sure.
Yeah, the Americans came, they brought work. Of course, they were popular. And their marriage, there was all kinds of marriages, I think 20, 40,000 marriages, and most of them were successful, very few divorces. So it was a big success socially and economically. Yeah.
And
socially and economically, we were always, I mean, the Boston States were always a big thing for Newfoundlanders. There was always a strong connection between Newfoundland and the eastern seaboard of the United States.
Exactly. In fact, before Confederation, Newfoundlanders didn't go to Toronto and Alberta for work. They went to the Boston States. And
Mm.
there was about 40,000 Newfoundlanders in Boston, all writing home saying, yes, join us, join the States, don't join Canada. Writing to their relatives at home, right? There's a big letter writing campaign that Boston got underway to try and draft Newfoundland in to the States. But that would have been a terrible embarrassment for Britain, and they wouldn't have got their war debt for all of it. It just would have been chaos, and Canada too, it would have been chaos. So the Brits and the Canadians got together, and they decided to make it happen, but pretend that it was Newfoundland's decision, but they would make it happen. How do you do
So,
that?
is it fair to call it a conspiracy?
Oh, very much so. It was a top level conspiracy involving prime ministers and all the top level governments of three countries: the States, Canada, and Great Britain. And you know, when they had this really odd arrangement, they didn't give when the time came, they wouldn't give Newfoundland back its government. They put up this national convention, the first election in Newfoundland in, I don't know, 15 years. But the Newfoundlanders who were elected to this national convention would have no power. They would only discuss and recommend what Britain should put on a ballot paper for a referendum on getting your own government back, or staying with the British government, or some other form of government. What other form of government could there possibly be? A monarchy? Join Russia? The only other form of government was Confederation. That's the only other plausible form of government. And that whole idea was to get Confederation in there on this ballot paper, this referendum, and then win the referendum for Confederation and then take her in. That's
So
how
that
they want to do it. Yeah.
so that first referendum with the three choices on it,
Yeah.
uh, the idea of the Commission of Government being ruled by Britain uh, was immediately removed.
It was
Nobody
defeated.
wanted
That's
that.
right.
Yeah.
It got the lowest numbers. So the British, they then decided to have a runoff, best two out of three. Really, responsible government, returning of Newfoundland's parliament, won by 6,000 votes, which was, that's what Confederation ended up winning by in the second vote.
Mhm.
But they said, no, we can't have that. We'll have a runoff. It's not enough overall votes. And so we'll have a runoff. So they kept changing the rules as they went along. So they had the runoff. And everything about that vote, from like Washington to London, MPs in Parliament were furious about the whole thing. They said it was the biggest blot on British democracy. They said Newfoundland was being railroaded in Parliament. All this stuff was said about it. And the Globe and Mail said it was illegal. The whole thing was done illegally. They had to violate the British North America Act, and the constitutional agreement between Newfoundland and Great Britain was all violated to do this. So there wasn't one good word said about it right around the world. It was, and in Newfoundland, people wore black armbands and went at the victory.
I've got to say, like, I think more than anything else, when reading the biggest emotion I felt when reading your book was anger. Um,
Yeah.
I'm not angry that I'm a Canadian. I've only ever been a Canadian.
I'm not either.
What I'm angry about is that the way that it transpired
Yes,
was obviously problematic in a big way.
it's right. It was a very abusive process,
E-
patronizing, paternalistic, condescending, and
Even even
go
if you
ahead.
set aside the conspiratorial sort of side of it, and you just look at the first vote. We said in the first vote we didn't want Britain governing our affairs, and then
Yes,
who managed our step into Confederation? The
yeah,
government we said we didn't want.
that's right. Most Newfoundlanders were not anti-Confederate by the end of the war, not really, but they were very much against the process that was being foisted on them of having to be taken into Canada by Britain. They didn't want Britain managing it, being the authority that did it. They wanted to do it on their own authority, naturally, because that was their right. But we were denied any meaningful self-determination. Those terms were never negotiated by any Newfoundland body. They were accepted by Britain. Imagine, by Britain. And MPs were furious at it. They couldn't believe that they had to do this, pass this bill. They said it will leave a nasty taste in Parliament forever, this bill, making Newfoundland part of Canada. And none of their criticisms were ever challenged. The best thing anyone ever said about the vote was that it was done and over with. That's the best thing ever said about that vote. And of course, the governor burnt 5,000 ballots after the vote was over.
Yes,
that's about what Confederation won by. And he, you know, why would you burn
it? Whether or not they were trying to hide anything, it certainly doesn't look like you weren't trying to hide something.
Yeah. Everyone in a lot of people in Newfoundland, especially everyone in St. John's, believed the fix was in before it was ever started. Soon as the National Convention, in the end, said, look, the terms we got from Canada are Canadian terms. They're not properly negotiated, and they will lead to bankruptcy in Newfoundland. We cannot have Confederation on the referendum ballot paper under those terms. So we are rejecting that and saying that the ballot paper should just contain two choices, either return of Newfoundland's government or stay with the British dictatorship, the appointed government, right? And Britain flipped and said, well, a lot of people in the convention wanted Confederation. They were a minority, but we're going to put it on anyway because it's only fair. They changed the rules again. And they went ahead and put Confederation on the ballot paper against the wishes of the only elected body of Newfoundlanders that there was, the National Convention. So everyone then said, oh, this is what they're doing. The fix is in. Confederation is going to win whatever we do. But then we had to go through the vote. And sure enough, Confederation.
I've often heard the story of ballot tampering, I suppose. Ballots going missing, lying about the vote. I mean, I think the movie Secret Nation back in the 90s, I think even, sort of maybe one of the first times I ever started to think about it that way. Because the story of Confederation, as I was taught in school, as I grew up learning it, is certainly a very sanitized version, I think, of what happened there.
Oh my God.
I think I was pretty much explicitly taught that Newfoundland was not able to govern itself. We were broke and Canada rescued us. That was basically the message.
Yeah.
And your book obviously lays out so much more than that. And I wasn't quite prepared before reading the book. I had imagined that the vote tampering thing was going to be a bigger part of your book, but you really don't spend very much time on that kind of idea of the conspiracy at all. You talk more about and provide evidence for in letters and documents from governments around the world and how they definitely wanted Confederation with Canada for Newfoundland. And certainly we're working toward making that happen. And even setting aside that part of the conspiracy idea, I had never really thought before about the nature of Newfoundland's government at the time of the Confederation debates, the Confederation discussion, and the fact that, as we discussed a few minutes ago, that it really wasn't a government of Newfoundlanders that was calling the shots when it came to Confederation.
No.
And I mean, that's not some shadowy secret. That's a very obvious and historical fact. And we never really talk about that.
No, we brush over that and go on, but that's the crux of the whole matter. That's the crux of the whole matter. I didn't claim the vote was fixed or rigged in the book because there's no hard evidence. You're never going to find a memo or a dispatch saying fix the vote. That's not how it's done.
They wouldn't be very good at conspiracies if they were going to write that down.
No, and the British were masters at conspiracy, and they didn't write that down. They're masters at
if we accept that the vote was what people actually voted, that it was pretty much 50-50, really. It was very, very close. So
Yeah.
whatever way you look at it, half the people didn't get what they wanted.
That's right. That's right. It was really too close to transfer sovereignty.
Yeah,
Really, like everyone says, you need a 2/3 majority. Oh, no, so the whole thing left such a bad taste, and it all left a bad taste on the Newfoundlanders. We were the ones who were called stupid in this. I wrote the book to get the real information out, to dispel, to get rid of that myth of Canadian and British fair play, because
right.
Canadians very much worked their own interests. They wanted to get it through Britain. The reason they wanted to get it through Britain, because they never would have got it so cheap otherwise.
Right.
Right?
Right.
That's why they did it.
So,
Didn't care about the terms.
it's been a dozen or so years since you first published the book, and it is now becoming the basis of a docu-series.
Yeah.
Um, what can we expect to see in the docu-series?
Well, you can see a lot of great pictures of all these guys going through the motions of doing this and what life was like back then. It's we have some great newsreel stuff of the times. I love it. And really it's a good kind of condensation of the book into the high points, all of the high points along the way. I mean, the British made this process very confusing and fuzzy for a good reason. They didn't want people to follow it. They didn't want it to be obvious what they were up to. They kind of clothed it in democratic appearance and all kinds of, high sounding phrases and stuff. So the process of the National Convention and all of that, it gets confusing for people. It really does. And I understand that. It took me 4 years to write the book. The first year or two, I was just trying to digest it all and get the story straight so that I could tell it, But but by now I got the story pretty straight. So I'll be narrating it, and we have some great interviews with all kinds of interesting people who have a lot of other knowledge about the period, and the footage is so exciting. I think it's going to be a very interesting documentary. You see all these fabulous people, Roosevelt and Churchill and Maynard Keynes and all the Mackenzie King and C.D. Howe. You see them all. You're familiar with these characters, but you're not familiar with seeing them in this setting. You're not familiar with this kind of action from them. This is a totally different side, the underbelly. I'm not an anti-Confederate. No one was really. I mean, there were some people who didn't want to join Confederation, and that was that. But most of the people who fought against British-run Confederation were against the British-run process. They were fine with Confederation. I'm fine with Confederation. I'm very glad we didn't become part of the United States. But we lost a lot. We lost much too much. And that's not generally known. It's been hidden under the myth of Canadian generosity and baby bonuses. But they took out the iron ore in Labrador, which was just discovered. They kept the results, which were just discovered when the National Convention was elected. They kept the results from the National Convention because they didn't want it to influence the vote, because the iron ore would have given Newfoundland its independent ticket, right? They knew that.
Yeah.
So Canada got that and became the steel leader in steel production in North America, and opened the St. Lawrence Seaway and built the railway to Seven-On, all of it, right? It was a huge boom for Canada, that iron ore. Quebec got the hydro from the Upper Churchill, as we know. That's sore point. René Lévesque boasted that it gave his separatist posture a spine, put spine in his separatism. But, and then the worst thing that they did was ran the cod fishery, the largest biomass on Earth, the reason for Newfoundland's colonization and population being there. They ran it into the ground. We had it for 400 years, and we turned it over to Canada. It was booming. And in 40 years, they ran it onto the brink of extinction. I like to say when the Americans came, they brought work and they paid well for it. When the Canadians came, they brought welfare. That's not what we wanted. We wanted work. We didn't want the welfare. But they made a big noise about the welfare, this, and we can't afford Newfoundlanders. They could well afford to support Newfoundlanders in much finer style than they did, considering all the money they got out of the place. They hit the jackpot when they got Newfoundland. And
I don't think young Newfoundlanders today can appreciate how important the cod fishery was to Newfoundland. I don't even mean that in a
That's right.
financial way.
No,
It
you're right. That's true.
it really was just part of who we were.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. There's songs about it, right? There's our whole lifestyle was built around the ocean and all those, thousands of little communities dotted all around the coast. That's who fed St. John's. That was the outports in St. John's. St. John's was a big outport, really. If you see St. John's, like between 1900s, it's all fish flakes up and down, the harbor. It's like one big giant outport. It's great. But I wanted to ask you, Robert, where are you from? Are you from St. John's or are you from where are you from in Newfoundland?
Happy Adventure near Eastport.
Oh, Happy Adventure near Eastport.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, very good. Yeah, nice. So, and where's your podcast? Where do you operate from now?
Gander.
You're in Gander now.
Yep.
Okay, okay, very good. Uh, I must stop and see you next time I'm going through Gander.
That would be awesome.
Yeah.
Uh, before we finish up, I guess, what are you up to these days?
Well, I'm writing a book, another book. It's called From Genesis to Jesus, the story of gender equality and same-sex love in the Bible. And we this is stuff, it's there, but we haven't noticed it, but it's all over the place. And I'm going to point it out to people how the Bible has been mistranslated and misrepresented, and that people don't know what they're talking about. They're just cherry picking the Bible for their own prejudices. That's all that's been going on. If you look at the Bible, it's not a homophobic document. The greatest, most passionate love story in the Bible is a same-sex love story between two men.
Okay. That is definitely not the that's not the aspects of the Bible they tend to focus on.
No, but I'll be focusing on it.
Well, and I mean, and I think that is I think that's a really interesting thing to do because so often the like you said, the Bible is cherry picked to beat up on people, and it would be wonderful to look at the other side of it and realize that maybe not everything in that book can be used in that way.
That's right, because so many people have used the Bible, Leviticus in particular, as a club to beat gay and lesbian, people over and to persecute them and all of it. It's the authority. It's the authority for prejudice against gay people, and it's nonsense. It's absolute. I'm going to deal with that and tear it to shreds in a way that people will understand, and look at the actual society at the time and how they treated homosexuality.
Um, just I don't think I find it surprising that you would take on that tact because again, when I look back through your career, CODCO again, that would be one of the things that I was surprised that you were so able to explore in the late 80s and early 90s. I've often said when I was growing up that there were very few LGBTQ, there was very little LGBTQ representation on television at all.
None.
And
None.
I think I must have forgotten about CODCO when I said that because there was quite a lot in CODCO.
Oh my God. We're always doing it. The guys are dressing up as women, the girls are dressing up as men.
Mhm.
And I played the first transgender character on Canadian TV, Dame Sir Leslie Lagore. And
Okay.
me and Tommy played the first gay characters on Canadian TV, Duncan and Jerome, Queen's Counselors at Large. And we had a lot of gay characters, and I mean, I did so many women characters. I never thought of it as drag when I was doing it. I thought I'm an actor. Now I'm doing a woman. Now I'm doing now I'm doing the Queen. I'm just acting. Now I'm
Mhm.
doing Margaret Thatcher. Okay, now they weren't glamorous people. They were political people, really, right? That was after, but and Tommy loved it. Tommy would hear nothing about it. Tommy wanted to do, all of them. He wanted to do Walters and Crystal Carrington and all that.
I think you guys were ahead of your time in a lot of ways. Like the humor that you showed in CODCO and the way that you tackled things either inspired a lot of the generation that
We were, I guess we were fortunate too. We all kind of knew each other a bit. And it was a time in Canada, I don't know, between old television and new television or something, you know. For instance, we did a scene called, it was called, Andy wrote it, it's called Pleasant Irish in Conversation. And it was, you know, deemed far too sexy for the air, for air. And so they didn't run it. And that was a big deal and all that. But that same year, Rush Limbaugh came out.
okay.
Everything it was out. And he was abusive and vulgar and everything and very popular. And so the whole kind of tone of radio and television kind of shifted in the States up to a more racy level that we have today. And in Canada, they felt a bit left behind Rush Limbaugh. So after, but a year after they had axed the scene and said we could never air it, they made it the star scene in a show of CODCO Uncensored. They put out a special show called CODCO Uncensored, and that was the main scene, and all the other really racy scenes that we'd done were in with it to show that we were a match for Rush Limbaugh in Canada, right?
Hey.
So it changed in a matter of 1 or 2 years. The whole system changed in our favor and kind of opened up. But CBC was nervous about us. Questions were asked in Parliament about CODCO, whether it was right to be spending the public's money on such a subversive and controversial show.
Yes, it was. Just as a thought that occurs to me now, did being from Newfoundland and having such an obvious Newfoundland perspective in the show, did that help with some of the subversive thing, being able to get away with some of the subversive things?
That's a good question. And I don't know if I know the answer to that. Maybe it did. Yeah, I never thought of that before, but maybe it did. It's possible. Like CBC was very nervous about it. They kept moving the show around a bit. If you'll notice, they were afraid. They wanted people to find it, but they didn't want to push it in people's face. You know what I mean? They didn't want to put it in prime time, you know, after supper with the kids watching CODCO. Even though so many families said to me, oh my God, Greg, CODCO is the only spiritual experience our family has. We all watch it every week together, like Mass or going to church. We have to watch CODCO, see what they're saying. Mm-hmm. Well, I was very pleased with that, I must say. And yeah, it was to liberate a lot. It was to liberate a lot of people that were repressed, you know, by prejudice, racial prejudice, sexual prejudice, all religious prejudice, all kinds of prejudice that we would take delight in going after, and try to make the world a you know, more friendly place for us all.
I've got a quote here. I think it was written by Denise Lind, but she said,
Yeah.
"Nothing was sacred. The more untouchable the target, the more savage the attack."
That's right. That's right.
And I mean, I think that's where I see this. I don't know. I don't know that I would say that the Confederation story is a sacred story, but I do see that you know there's a parallel there to your willingness to go in and dismantle what we think we know, what we've been fed, and what we've been told, and lay out another alternative.
The book is kind of the formal version of what CODCO did informally and with humor. But I couldn't put humor in the book because I wouldn't be taken seriously. I had to keep it straight to the point, and I had to make sure I left no holes for anyone to pick at. I had to put all the documents in and back up everything that was said in the book to the hilt. So that was the job. And I must say I got angry a lot of times writing the book and overwhelmed with what I was reading and finding out. But I think it's good information for people to have. It'll liberate people and make them feel better about themselves and what they did and what we did. You know, Newfoundlanders have felt shame about that period in history a lot of times, and we don't need to. We fought for our freedom and we fought for our rights. Who should feel shame is Britain, and Canada, but they are shameless, apparently. They don't have the decency to feel the shame for what they did. I want an apology now from Canada.
I'm sure that will be forthcoming.
Yeah.
I, I do think that our history, that the issue with Confederation and the way that we felt about ourselves after Confederation has cast a very long shadow. As I said earlier, I was born a Canadian. These debates were settled long
Yeah.
before my memory. I have no memory of that stuff, obviously,
Yeah.
and yet I feel that it informed who I am and how I think about my place in the world. And I think that people, my listeners, my readers, probably think of me as a very proud Newfoundlander, and I definitely am.
Yeah.
But I think I arrived at that uh, by burning through a sense of feeling less than. I think for a long time I felt like Newfoundland was less than,
Yeah.
and then I realized, no, we are not less than, not at
That's
all.
that's right. That's right.
This is the place.
This is the place. It is. I mean, and Newfoundland punches way above its weight. Our biggest export is people. You know what I mean? Entertainers, writers, broadcasters, actors, musicians. In artistically, we punch way above our weight. It's only, my God, only 500,000 of us.
I know it's crazy.
Yeah, yeah, and in a lot of other areas, we're quite good, But it's a funny place, Newfoundland. It's wild and backward, and it's ahead of its time at the same. It's both. So I mean, we're not like a colony like Nova Scotia. We don't have counties. We never had any of the institutions of colonization. There was no municipality even outside St. John's. And St. John's didn't get its municipal charter until the 1800s. It was illegal to be here. And yet it was completely settled. But people had that more individual outlook and self-reliant, that rugged outlook. We was like the Wild West, but we're the East. And we were wild when we went into Canada. And that's what Canada was terrified of. No one needed an influx of hardworking, hard partying Newfoundlanders more than Canada.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for joining me. I can't recommend the book enough. It is very informative, but more than just being very informative, it's a very engaging read. You might not have been able to get as funny with it as you wanted to, but you still created a book that is imminently readable and people will devour, I think.
Thanks, Robert. Here's the book if anyone wants the detail. You can still get it on Amazon, and I think at Down Homer, you can get the book. There you go. Well, thanks for inviting me on. I had a really good time, and I enjoyed meeting you and all that. So thanks again.
Yeah, thank you very much. I can't wait for your new book to get out too. So we'll be watching for that and the docuseries.
Well, I'll come back and have another chat with you then, maybe, huh?
I would love that.
Okay.
Keep an eye out for Don't Tell the Newfoundlanders, a 6-part series made by Monroe Street Media and coming soon to Bell 5 TV. Watch the blog and follow my social media, Product of Newfoundland. I spell it Product of NFLD, for all the details. You can get Greg's books, You Better Watch Out, and Don't Tell the Newfoundlanders, wherever books are sold. And the CODCO sketch that Greg discussed, Pleasant Priests in Conversation, the one that was initially too much for the CBC, well, it's alive and well on YouTube these days. I'll put a link to it on the episode page. Okay, we'll cap off this episode the same way I end almost every episode of Strange Truths and Tall Tales, with another installment of Monstrous Things. Today, keeping on theme, I have what I guess is one of the first Canadian sea monsters spotted in Newfoundland waters. It happened in 1953 near Cabot Island, not far from Cape Friels. It was August 1953, and Pools Island fishermen were buzzing with the report of a leaping sea monster sighted at Cabot Island banks and Charge Rock. Yep, you heard that right, an actual sea monster. According to multiple accounts reported in the Daily News out of St. John's, this creature was no jumping porpoise. Witness described it as about 50 feet long with a head resembling that of a seal. Its dorsal fins were small, but the tail? That's another story. Large, powerful, and, well, unforgettable. One fisherman reported the monster jumping completely out of the water, only to come crashing down with its massive tail, creating a resounding splash that echoed across the waves. The sea monster's antics didn't end there. In one dramatic encounter, a fisherman reportedly shot at the creature. It didn't retaliate, but swam off, vanishing into the depths. What was it? I certainly don't know. If you have any idea, well, the comments are always open, and I'd love to hear from you. Well, that's it for another episode, and the first in Season 3. Cars, Confederation, CODCO, and cryptids. Not bad for an hour. That's one great thing about Newfoundland. There are so many strange truths and tall tales, you never know where a yarn's going to take you. I'd like to thank Greg Malone. Keep an eye out for Don't Tell the Newfoundlanders docuseries on 5TV, and subscribe to Strange Truths and Tall Tales wherever you get your podcast. There are more cool stories and great chats on the horizon, and there's always new stuff on the blog. Besides a bunch of Halloween stories, I recently shared the tale of Newfoundland's last bison. You can check that out at productofnewfoundland.ca. I'll see you here at Strange Truths and Tall Tales for Episode 2 pretty soon. Have a great day.